Particles sometimes suck, they pull, they push, they whirl, and worst of all, they have UV coordinates. Hello and welcome to this free unscripted thinkingParticles 7.3 tutorial video. In this video I will show you how to create a particle cloud, assign UV coordinates and apply various forces to the particles. Enough talk, let's see how the particle UV effect was done. This is the scene we are working with right now. Let's have a look what objects are in the scene. In this scene we can see that we have an area light. Just for information, I can turn it on. So that's an area light. We're not interested in that right now. We have a physical camera, thinking particles, and two forces. One force is a standard motion field from 3D Studio Max. So that's nothing special. You can have that in 3D Studio Max, standard motion field. And we did some adjustments here. For example, we just use along axis, around axis, away from axis. And this will create a nice whirl effect, so a rotational effect. And also from the side we can see we are pushing particles up and in a circle. So that's our motion field, and we have one other force, and that's also a standard 3D Studio Max wind force. And probably the most we want this force is for sucking particles back in to the point. It's a spherical force, and I want to have a little bit of turbulence so that our particles wobble and move a little bit in a turbulent motion. So these two forces we have here, and these two forces create our particle movement pretty automatic. Let's have a look how this looks like. Let me just get that in full screen and I'll just play back. So we have that playing back in real time where we can see textures, particle movements, our force fields working really nice and whirling and mixing through our particles. So our poor Mona Lisa has been disintegrated and all the pixels of Mona Lisa are moving around and are whirled around with the standard forces in 3D Studio Max. So let's have a look how we did the setup in thinkingParticles. In thinkingParticles, let me just bring up the user interface. In thinkingParticles, I have two dynamic sets. I have the create dynamic set. I'm going through the create dynamic set, and we have this debug dynamic set. And the debug dynamic set, I'll right click on the debug dynamic set name to turn it off. Right now it's turned off, and I just get the standard particle color we have here. And we can see these are just plain particles, nothing else, no color or anything. And with the debug, what I'm doing here, I just turned it on by right clicking again on my debug dynamic set. I just use the particles we stored here, and the particles have a data channel color. So each particle comes with its own color. So I'm accessing every single particle here, grab the color, and in our viewport color node, we can assign colors for our particles. I can assign the color per particle. So I get the particle here along with the real color value. And that is giving us the view or representation of what we assign, what texture we have assigned there. So how do we UV map particles in space? So that's very often a question we get in our support, and people want to know how can you map particles? How can you map points? And it's actually pretty simple and straightforward with thinkingParticles. There's, as always, many options to do this. So you could do this with standard thinkingParticles nodes. However, I want to show you our latest addition we had in thinkingParticles 7.3, the MEL expression language. That makes it much easier and, most important, much faster, because we can now do parallel processing on particles. So we don't have to do complex serial node setups, we can access our particles right away at any time. So let me first start with the creation of our painting here, of our Mona Lisa painting. The first input we have here is our born operator. The born node just creates right now 80,000 particles. I can change that to any number I want. So we are creating 80,000 particles, and we are feeding them into the generator input. So let me just bring up my script interface where we can see the MEL code. And it's actually pretty simple and straightforward. I have reused the code to create a rasterized placement of particles. I have a tutorial video about that as well. So check out the rasterized tutorial video that explains how to create particles in a raster and how we can control the raster with these settings: dimension X, dimension Y, and raster size. So pretty simple. I recycled the code that was already there, and we are now just spreading the particles in the raster size, so where we have the dimensions and the minimum distance between particles. So how do I get from a raster to a UV coordinate? Because what we need later is we need per pixel or per particle a UV coordinate. And the great thing about UV is it's nothing else than a raster. A UV coordinate is just a raster between 0 and 1 in each axis. So what we are doing is we are creating our virtual UV coordinates here based on our particle positions. So I just say, okay, the particle position is my UV coordinate because we are creating these particles in a raster. So let me just zoom in here a little bit more. We can see we are creating these particles each in each row and column. So we use 0 to 1 and 0 to 1 up here. And all we need to do is store the particle position as a UV coordinate. So that's pretty it. So I know exactly for each particle I position here with our ny and an x value where we have our xy position. I know exactly that's also my UV coordinate. So the only thing left is we need to have a texture map, and here we have the texture map. We can have a look in our material editor. We can see that's just a bitmap, nothing else. So there's nothing magic or fantastic going on. It's just a bitmap we are using here. So I feed in this bitmap into the texture input. We created a texture input up here called texture. And then I can call from the texture function, from the texture in function, I can call the evaluation function. And if I ever wanted to know what does this function do or how does it work, I can press the S-help button anytime. And there we will get the explanation of the texture map, how it's called, what it does, what parameters we need to supply. So it's very simple, straightforward to learn the scripting language, or if you forgot something or want to know which function to use, just press the S-help button when your cursor is here. So what we need to supply is the UV coordinate, and we get back the texture color. So I call this with the UV coordinate, and in our variable texture color, it's a 0.3 variable, we get the color back from our texture. So as we move from 0 to 1, we get our color back. Then we get our position for the particles, we add them up, and then we do a little bit of, we are setting the particles because our born is a generator, so all particles are at the 0, 0 or origin position. So we just place them in the raster. So this is the raster function. And as I already mentioned, I have another tutorial where I just explain how this is done to create a raster of particles. And then the next thing is pretty simple and straightforward. we are just going to set the color in a data channel. So we use the data channel, and we, as I mentioned also before, we have a data channel called color, or CD is the name of the data channel. It's a color data channel, and we are storing the color per particle. So we are setting the position, we are setting the color, and also what we do is we assign a shape. And we assign a standard shape here. I connected the standard shape to the shape input. We created the shape input here. So I'll assign a standard sphere shape with the material we apply, and that's our Mona Lisa material. So we assign the shape to the particle we just created or positioned. And then the last step is we give it the, according to the raster, we give it a size. So the particle have a size based on the raster input here. And that's all. And all particles that do not fit within the raster, so if we born more particles than we need for a raster, for a certain raster and dimension, we just kill them. So right now, as I said, we created 80,000 particles. And now just check out the particle count. When I go one step further, we get updated. So now we have the real particle count, 15,000 particles right now that fit in the raster with this raster size. When I reduce the raster size, let me just make the raster smaller. We will get, let me just move back. We will get more particles. So we have now 60,000. And if I reduce even more the raster size, let me just go back. You will see that we don't have enough particles with this raster size. So all 80,000 particles are now used up for our, so we can't fill our dimension with a 0.5 raster. So let me just, for the sake of the tutorial, go back to our original raster size. And now we have all the particles we need for our painting. So this upper part here, this melt script is responsible for creating the raster, assigning the colors, the positions, and the shape. Pretty straightforward, really easy stuff here. Let's have a look at the next expression, and we already can see it has a connected standard force node. That's the standard thinkinParticles node that allows us to use any standard force in 3D Studio Max. And we see active is wind and motion field. These are the two forces I just showed you in the introduction of the video. Let's have a look at this. The most important part is the particles, where we created the particles. The born operator creates the particles in this particle group, and we want to access the same particles in parallel. So accessing these particles in parallel is done by having the first input decides which data we want to access in parallel in multi-threading. So the first input is our group input, particle group, and we assign the particle group here with our group we created here. So now we get all the particles in parallel, whatever amount of particles we have, 100,000, a million, 2 million, doesn't matter. We go over these particles in parallel, and then the next input is our force input. We wanted the standard force. And here, this is all you need to do to apply a force on any amount of particles with a parallel processing. So we just apply from all the particles we go through in parallel, we apply the force. Very simple call of standard forces. And that's it. There is nothing else we need to do for our little effect here, for our little visual effect we have going on here. So we just created the particles, we born them with a born node at position 0. Then we place the particles in a raster. Particles that don't fit the raster are either deleted or are missing. So we have only half of the image if we have a too fine raster. And we assign a standard shape. So let's wrap up this video. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned some new stuff. Keep in mind we have many other free videos you can check out as well. Hope to see you again. Thank you and goodbye.